Hello, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are across the United States today. And welcome to a special USBC webinar. Our webinar today is entitled Structural Racial Equity, an Introduction. And my name is Megan Renner from the United States Breastfeeding Committee, and I will be conducting our webinar today. Just by way of a bit of introduction, as many of you know, USBC has committed to taking on racial equity as a core issue and to identify and lift up opportunities for a racial equity analysis capacity building for the field. We are very fortunate to have begun this journey with the guidance and wisdom of the Center for Social Inclusion and supported by our funding as a W.K. Kellogg Foundation First Food Field Builder grantee. The Center for Social Inclusion, or CSI, facilitated a workshop for the National USBC membership meeting just back in the summer of 2013, and they also offered a full-day pre-conference workshop at the National Breastfeeding Coalition's conference just this past summer, which some of you may have been able to attend. So now we are thrilled to be taking the next step to reach an even larger audience. We have hundreds of folks registered for this webinar today, so welcome to all of you. Today's overview webinar will outline the basics of a structural racial equity approach, and CSI will share their racial equity analysis and some strategies that create structural inclusion for people of all races and incomes. Just a little bit of logistics that I'll go through first, including that, of course, today's webinar is being recorded, and we will, as with all USBC webinars, post the audio and video recording. We're actually going to be posting it on our YouTube channel, which might be a little bit different for folks than some of the other ways that we post webinars, but you'll be able to access it at this link here within 3 business days. And we'll also post a link on that same YouTube listing to the slides, so that you'll also be able to access the PDF of the slides on that YouTube listing. During today's session, all attendees will be in listen-only mode. I know some of you are joined by your telephone, some by your computer microphone, but do not fear, you can't be heard because of the size of the audience. Your audio will be in listen-only mode, but we do encourage you to submit questions at any time during the webinar, and you can do that by typing your question into the questions box on your webinar control panel. So I'll show you just what that looks like. So you should be seeing here the webinar control panel. If by chance your control panel has collapsed and minimized itself, which sometimes it does, you might be seeing just this little tab with the orange arrow. And if that has happened, just go ahead and click the orange arrow and it will expand it back out when you need to type a question or interact with the controls. And you'll see on the left side picture, here's what the questions box looks like. You'll have a little spot to type a question here. Another thing you might see is if the questions arrow is turned to the right, just click on that little gray arrow and it will open itself down. So again, we encourage folks to ask questions at any time during our session today. And also, if you should be having any audio problems, technical difficulties, we do encourage you to email questions about that to our office address. That's office@usbreastfeeding.org. And that way you don't have to hang up your phone. You can just can write in there, and we have staff who can help out without you having to hop off of your line. So before I turn it over to our wonderful presenter today, I'll just say a few words of introduction. We will have Julia Beatty from the Center for Social Inclusion presenting for us today. And as the coordinator for leadership initiatives at CSI, she develops trainings and oversees CSI's New Leaders Initiative. She brings a strong background in community organizing, public policy advocacy, organizational development, and social justice philanthropy to her work. And prior to joining the CSI team, Ms. Beatty served in several exciting roles, including as the program director for the 21st Century Foundation, leading its Gulf Coast Organizing, Advocacy, and Leadership Initiative, which raised more than $4 million in grant-making and capacity-building support for grassroots organizations working to transform post-Katrina communities. Ms. Beatty also served as a program officer at the Ms. Foundation for Women, managing all aspects of the organization's collaborative fund for youth-led social change. And another role, she is a former president of the United States Student Association, a policy advocacy organization representing hundreds of thousands of student members nationwide, advocating for increased access to education for women, people of color, LGBT people, low income, and other populations traditionally underrepresented at the college level. Ms. Beatty holds a BA in journalism from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and an MPA from New York University. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Beatty to talk with us today about structural racial equity approach. You should have control now, and we see your screen.
All right. Good morning and good afternoon to all of you with the U.S. Breastfeeding Committee. Thank you so much for having me today, and thank you, Megan, and the USBC staff for partnering with us over this past year. It's been quite a meaningful partnership, and it's a real honor to be able to speak with many of you all today. Today, the title of my presentation is Structural Race Equity, an Introduction. And as Megan introduced me, I'm Julia Beatty, the Coordinator for Leadership Initiatives at the Center for Social Inclusion. I want to tell you a little bit about the Center for Social Inclusion. We are a national policy advocacy intermediary with expertise in uniting policy reform strategies and grassroots advocacy to transform inequity and exclusion into fairness and inclusion. We work with community groups and national organizations to develop policy ideas, to foster leadership, and to also develop communications tools that will create an opportunity-rich world in which we will all thrive, no matter what our race and ethnicity is. And we are one of the components of the structural race analysis. And simply put, this means that our mission is to dismantle structural racial inequity, which are the multi-institutional policies, practices, and actions that isolate communities and people of color from opportunities. Today's goals are threefold. The first is to establish a shared context and framework of structural inequity. The second is to build a common understanding of the role that policy plays with regard to race and structural equity in the United States. And the third is to leave with some ideas on how to advance racially equitable policy ideas in your communities. Now, these are some hefty goals, but I think we'll be able to get through this. And a lot of terminology I'll have a chance to break down for you in a bit. Before we start, we want to do a little bit of polling to see where folks are with their readiness around talking about structural racial equity in these issues. So there's a poll that USBC has set up for us, 2 questions. The first is, how comfortable are you now with your understanding of structural racial equity? And the second is, how comfortable are you now with applying a structural racial equity analysis to the work of your organization? So the first question is really about how comfortable are you right now with understanding really what structural racial equity is, what it means. And the second is, how comfortable are you applying this analysis to the work that you are doing? So I'll give folks a couple of seconds to fill in their poll. We'll ask these 2 questions again at the end of the webinar to get a sense of how folks' learning has increased, hopefully, at the end of our presentation today. So before we step into the nitty-gritty, let's examine a couple of key facts and some terminology regarding race that I'll be using throughout the presentation.
Oh, Julia, hang on just a second.
Yes,
I'm just
sure.
closing the first poll.
Okay.
So I'm just going to go ahead and show the results of that one. And then I'll have to run the second one here for just a few seconds. So,
okay.
Do you see the
so I'll
one?
Hold off. I do.
So heavy in the warming, but spread about, it looks like. All right.
Okay, good. Thank you for that.
No problem. I'm going to launch the second one here now, so folks you should see the second poll question now about applying the analysis to the work of your organization or coalition. So go ahead and vote there. Yeah, they're faster this time. Here we go. We're already up to 45%.
Awesome.
You got their attention. All right, I'm going to give it another 10 seconds or so, and then I'll show the results on this one. Okay, I think we've plateaued here. Okay, so let me share the second one here, and now you should see a similar distribution, although a little bit more on the 1 and 2 for this one, it looks like.
Okay. Great. Well, hopefully by the end of this presentation, we'll have an opportunity to, yeah, I do see that about 31% of you are warming, but a number more of you all are still sort of warming up, cold or thawing. And the application, you know, the implementation of these ideas really is where the rubber meets the road. And so this is great. Hopefully, we'll see an uptick in some of those poll numbers around the warming end at the end of our time together. So going back to these two key facts on race, you know, the first key point I just want to mention is that race is a construct and is not biologically determined. It is a modern idea. And policy drives the social construction of race and has contributed to changing ideas and definitions of race over time. Essentially, not one characteristic, trait, or gene distinguishes members of one race from another race. It's not biologically determined. Rather, it is an idea that has evolved over time to justify many agendas. In the past, race was used as a justification of the enslavement of people who looked physically similar. And as a concept and construct of race evolved, it justified the extermination of Native Americans, the exclusion of Asian Americans from many aspects of society, and the taking of Mexican lands. And racially discriminatory practices were institutionalized into law, government, and within society. Thus, policy really drives the social construction of race. We'll talk more about policy history in a bit to examine this particular point in greater depth, but my main takeaway I'd like you to leave with this particular slide is that race continues to be a powerful construct that determines who has access to opportunities in our society and who does not. And our government and society is arranged in such a way to privilege some groups over others based on race. So let's also jump into a definition of racial equity and make sure that we're all on the same page of understanding what we mean. Racial equity would be achieved when life outcomes are equal in a statistical sense, regardless of one's racial identities. Racial equity is both our lens and the outcome we seek to achieve. It is an inclusive approach to transform structures towards access, justice, self-determination, redistribution, and sharing of power and resources. So racial equity essentially refers to both a process and a set of outcomes. Creating racially equitable communities means not only working to change systems so that they do not disproportionately benefit some over others based on one's racial identity, but it also means that the process by which we work towards shifting these systems towards a justice-oriented framework, it must include those communities that are doing the most poorly within systems, institutions, and structures than others based on race. In this sense, diversity in our strategies is one component of racial equity, but not the end-all, be-all. Diversity ensures inclusive representation, but racial equity requires a systems analysis and lens to ensure that we are transforming structures in a way that begins to chip away at the barriers to opportunity for many people of color. And I want to spend a moment on equality versus equity. Oftentimes, we mix these terms up, but they actually mean different things. The idea of equal access is fundamental to our democracy, and in the 18th century, the notion that all men were created equal set up the powerful expectation that every citizen deserves the same opportunity to influence the course of democracy and to benefit from the fruits of a good society. But when a society is stratified into poles of advantage and disadvantage, with the inevitable consequences of privilege and exclusion, the promise of equal access to the opportunities necessary to democratically participate in society rings hollow. In an equality framework, fairness means equal access and opportunity. Correspondingly, access to channels of communication and sources of information that is made available on even terms to an all-level playing field is derived from the concept of fairness as uniform distribution, where everyone is entitled to the same things, the same level of access, and can thus avail themselves to them if they so choose. However, the reality is something different.
Our country was not founded on all people being equal to democratically participate. It was founded on the notion that all men are equal, particularly property-owning white men of a certain class, not black men, nor poor white men, or women of any kind. An equity framework recognizes that groups of people have been historically excluded or lack the information, income, tools, or training necessary to participate fully in our democracy. Rather, they must overcome obstacles in order to access fairness. In other words, an equity framework posits that fairness also demands remedies to redress historic injustices that have prevented or diminished access in the first place. For just as there can be no fairness without equality, there can be no fairness without justice. So in order to maximize opportunities for access experienced by certain groups, a good society commits resources in order to level the playing field. In essence, in the picture that you see here, equality versus equity, an equality framework essentially ignores that people of different races, classes, genders, and sexual orientations, and in this case, people of different heights, they're starting out at different points. It assumes that all people need the same thing. However, what this picture demonstrates is actually people need different things and able to have an equal chance or a fair shot, or in this case, an equal opportunity to watch the baseball game. An equity framework acknowledges that past and current discrimination, whether intentioned or not, has an impact on where a person begins on the starting line of this race called life. So let's jump into, now that we've set forth some terminology and gotten on the same page about what we mean in terms of equity and what we talk about when we think about race, let's step into the structural race analysis, which is really the lens through which we use a perspective, right, or a way of seeing that acknowledges race and racial inequity. So what is our current context of race here in the United States? Well, we have a black president. So mainstream discourse speaks to the idea of a post-racial society, meaning that we are beyond the era when race still matters. And this logic posits that if we are indeed in a post-racial society, then life outcomes should no longer be determined by race, as it no longer matters. After all, like I said, we have a black president. How could something like that happen in a race-based society? Well, the reality is actually something different. Over the course of the past year, we've been witness to several national events that speak to the unjust nature of institutions towards people of color, particularly within the criminal justice and law enforcement systems. Mike Brown of Ferguson, Trayvon Martin of Miami, Ramarley Graham and Eric Garner of New York City are a few examples. And additionally, when we look at how well communities of color are faring with regard to their economic health and sustainability, we see another inequitable picture. And here you'll see in the lower right a small graph that details the percentage change in median net worth of households from 2005 to 2009. While everyone has experienced a drop in wealth, and this is all between 2005 and 2009, people are doing very differently based on race. Black communities have, black households have experienced a more than, or 53% change, negative change in net worth, Hispanics at 66% change, negative, and whites at 16%. So this essentially shoots down the notion that post-racialism is really in effect here in this society, because still people are doing differently based on their racial identity. So now that we've shot down the idea of post-racialism, let's examine the different types of racism that do exist. We are going to be focused with talking about structural racism, but I think it's important to talk through these different types. Individual racism is judgment or bias or discrimination by an individual based on race. Institutional racism points to the policies, practices, and procedures that work to the benefit of white people and to the detriment to people of color, often unintentionally or inadvertently. And structural racism looks at a history and current reality of institutional racism across all institutions, and this combines to create a system that negatively impacts communities of color. So our structural analysis is really a meta-analysis of how all of these different moving parts interlock to either create opportunity or create barriers for people to opportunity. And what we're concerned about at CSI is creating access to opportunities for all people regardless of their race and ethnicity. So what are structures? Well, structures are part of our everyday lives, even if we don't see them because they are oftentimes invisible. Structures are essentially the arrangement of and relations between the parts of or elements of something complex, such as a system. This description of structure implicitly offers an account of what a system is made of, a configuration of items, a collection of interrelated components. It is a system that we seek to transform through our advocacy work, such as changing the ways in which breastfeeding mothers are supported in a healthcare, community, and workplace setting. And so in those three pieces, healthcare, community, and workplace is an example of how three different structures or institutions oftentimes are interacting together to determine whether or not a woman has a choice to breastfeed. These are elements of a bigger system. And if you look at this picture here, we see things are linked. We have a bus in the middle representing transportation. And the idea here is that, ideally, all of our communities should have these things: places for young people to play, a nice place to live, healthy food, affordable food, access to good quality health care, access to employment that pays a living wage, and transportation to get there, right? All of these things are interconnected and have an impact on how our lives are lived. And our brains are oftentimes wired subconsciously due to structures. And whenever we do this exercise I'm about to introduce, well, let me introduce the exercise first before I get into the lessons behind it. So what I want you all to do is take out a piece of paper and take the following steps. First, choose a number between 1 and 10. Now, multiply this number by 9. Now add the two digits together. So 18 would give 1 plus 8, which would equal 9. Next, subtract 5 from your answer. Now, associate your number that you've derived with a letter from the alphabet. So for example, A equals 1, B equals 2, and so on and so forth. Next, think of a country beginning with that letter. Then, think of the last letter in the country's name, and think of an animal where that starts with that letter. For example, England ends with a D, so you can associate that with dog. Finally, think of the last letter in the animal's name and think of a fruit that starts with that letter. I'll give you all a couple more seconds to do your algebraic equations. I know most of us are advocates and not mathematicians. At least I am, not one. All right, so hopefully everybody has gone through all 8. Are you thinking about kangaroos in Denmark eating oranges? Well, whenever we do this exercise with workshop participants, it's really hard to get a sense with folks over the phone and the computer what you all derived. But almost every time we discovered that, we find the majority of participants are thinking about kangaroos in Denmark eating oranges. And this sort of shows how our brains are oftentimes wired subconsciously due to structures and how and what those structures mean. There are actually only 3 countries on the planet that begin with the letter D, and most of our brains oftentimes immediately go to Denmark, as it is a country in Europe that is oftentimes more researched, spoken about, and also represents a country in the industrialized, developed world. Less likely, people will think about Djibouti, it's a country in Africa, or Dominica, which is a Caribbean island. Our brains have been conditioned to think within a set of structured arrangements that prioritize information and knowledge about Denmark over that of less industrialized countries such as Dominica and Djibouti. And this exercise is just a simple way to demonstrate how structures arrange information and ideas in our minds, oftentimes with us even realizing it. And again, this is why having a structural racial analysis is really important and thinking really critically about race at the forefront of our strategies around changing conditions for women and promoting opportunities for breastfeeding. Because it's these kinds of structural structures that are oftentimes invisible, but are oftentimes working together, or all the time interacting together to create a set of outcomes. So what we mean by structural racism? Well, structural racism points to multiple institutions. It's the way our public and private institutions interact to produce barriers to opportunity and racial disparities. And oftentimes the intent to discriminate is irrelevant. Structures just do what they do, often invisibly, just like the exercise we just did, and reinforce disinvestment and disparities. Let's go a little bit deeper. Multi-institutional means we're not just talking about institutional racism. And to break down the difference between those two, for example, institutional racism is what we see in the unfair or discriminatory racial profiling that occurs within criminal justice, right? That's an institution. Or let's say education being an institution. If a principal has a certain set of expectations for the white students in his school, but has a very different or lower set of expectations for the Southeast Asian students in the school, well, those Southeast Asian students may potentially face more barriers to having a quality education because the leader of that institution just doesn't believe that they're good enough. Multi-institutional really looks at the ways that all of the institutions, the education, economy, and the environment, they are linked and they oftentimes reinforce each other. And so this goes beyond individual institutions, which means that solving racial disparities in one institution may not necessarily improve disparities in others. So we really have to look at the whole picture, right? People need affordable housing that they can afford to pay for. But if you put that affordable housing in areas where there are poor quality schools, then what will happen? Well, those kids will have poor educational outcomes. But if you put those affordable housing structures in neighborhoods that have high opportunity and have good schools, then what happens? You open up a lot of opportunities for those children. So this is what it means, and this is why it matters to think structurally. It is policy-driven, structural racism. And we'll talk about policy history later, but I do want to refer back to the point I made earlier, which is that policy drives the construction of race. For instance, who is really white? Now this has, in fact, changed a great deal over time, and all of this was due to policy. Today, people of European descent are considered white, but 100 years ago they were not. What we consider today as white was not always the case. In the South, the Jim Crow codes also included Italians. Early colonial laws refer to Christians or Englishmen rather than whites, reflecting the greater importance of religious or national differences. And around the time of Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, new laws began to appear, separating black slaves from European indentured servants. The 1790 Naturalization Act restricts naturalized American citizenship to whites. And in the early 20th century, many new arrivals petitioned the courts to be legally designated white in order to gain citizenship and ultimately opportunity. Armenians, known as Asiatic Turks, succeed with the help of anthropologist Frank Boas, who testifies as an expert scientific witness, but others were not so fortunate. In 1922, the Supreme Court concluded that Japanese are not legally white because science classifies them as Mongoloid rather than Caucasian. So again, policy has not only constructed blackness, but it's constructed whiteness as well, and other meanings for different races and ethnicities. The intent to discriminate is not necessarily required. No longer do we need to look for the Clive and Bundy in the room, right? The racist Nevadan rancher who we saw several months ago. When we think about racism, we often think about intentional individual acts of bias. And that's very real, but structural racism occurs even unintentionally and often well-intentioned. And we'll get to this more in our policy discussion. People of color are more often than not positioned poorly in structures, so the impact of policy is racialized. People of color oftentimes near the worst schools, far from jobs, closer to environmental hazards. They have the worst access to good and healthy, affordable food. But it's also important to understand that structural racism harms everyone by shrinking the tax base, by underfunding public services, creating social tension, limiting economic growth, and et cetera. Structural racism has an impact on our attitudes. For example, if you have never engaged with a black person before, and if most of the predominantly black neighborhoods you've ever driven through are characterized by deteriorating physical conditions and high unemployment, then you may begin to adopt negative attitudes about people, right? Why can't those people get it together? So if you see the results of a structure that is racialized and is not seeing all groups differently, then your attitude becomes, well, what's wrong with them? And let's remember Paul Ryan's recent comments regarding inner city men that don't want to work, who have a culture problem. And this is an example of attitudes, the impact on attitudes that is derived from structural racism. And finally, racial disparities are merely symptoms of the deeper problems. And if we don't work to change structures in strategic ways by looking at the whole picture, then just addressing disparities won't solve the in one area won't solve the problem. So how do we get here? It's important to understand that policies we have enacted over time helped invest in the success of some and prevented barriers for others. The way our communities are designed and segregated is a direct result of policies that invested in some people while leaving others out. And these very policies creating the middle class as we know it today. This is not a race-neutral process. If we look at the social programs of the early and mid-1900s, which built the middle class we know today and shaped our communities and regions, people of color were largely left out. And the reason we see barriers for people of color today has everything to do with our policy history, and it also has everything to do with how current policy decisions tend to reinforce past history. So let's examine further. Social Security. Starting in the 1930s, New Deal era policies were passed, and for the first time in U.S. history, the government took a prominent role in investing in people's livelihoods. It was this series of government investments that have built the middle class as we know it today. And one of the ways that the policy achieved this was through the Social Security Act of 1935, which remains the foundation for the program today. However, this program was biased against black communities and women, particularly black women, since its inception. The 1935 Act limited its coverage only to workers in commerce and industry. This meant that the new social insurance program applied to only about half of the jobs in the economy. Among those left out were agricultural and domestic workers. And in the 1930s, more than 75% of agricultural and domestic workers in the South were black. In this particular case, although the policy appeared race-neutral on its face, it wasn't. Southern Democrats in Congress were the agents who engineered this restrictive coverage policy. And what history can now tell us is that Southern Democrats in Congress, motivated by racial animus, moved to block African Americans for participation in the new Social Security program, and that this was the reason for the provision excluding farm and domestic labor. This was a political move to make the Social Security Act more palatable to Southern congressmen that benefit from the structural exclusion of black communities and to ensure the status quo economic system of the South. And it's important to note also that the Social Security Act shows us a very concrete example of how racial inequity and discrimination also hurts white people as well. By leaving out virtually half of the workforce from its original coverage policy, many poor and working class white workers were unable to benefit from retirement and disability programs that were not only critical to their family's ability to become part of the growing middle class, but also just to survive and thrive. Another one of the major ways that the New Deal policy invested in the success of some while creating barriers for others was by making home ownership affordable for millions of families through the creation of the Federal Housing Administration. People of color, however, were redlined out of benefit. In 1936, nearly 8 million other African Americans moved north in the Great Migration, and in the North, city governments, banks, and realtors adopted policies and practices like segregationist zoning rules and restrictive covenants that were designed to keep African Americans in certain neighborhoods and out of others. Housing in these black neighborhoods were scarce and often overpriced, and city and state governments allowed landlords to maximize their profits by dividing larger units into smaller flats, creating overcrowding and unhealthy living conditions. And with the majority of hospitals segregated and few African American physicians in these neighborhoods, black communities were also forced to deal with health problems. And if we just recall the Social Security policy history that I just spoke about, people of color with debilitating health problems that rendered them unable to work were denied disability benefits through Social Security. And so at the same time that all of this is happening, the Federal Housing Administration was providing loans to help white families move out of the cities and into the suburbs. But the FHA's practice of redlining discouraged loans in black communities and mixed communities. In fact, something that really surprised me when I first learned this is that mixed communities or integrated communities were given a lower credit rating than predominantly black communities. So essentially, integration was not encouraged. and instead, loans flow to borrowers in white middle-class neighborhoods. People of color were often made ineligible because of discrimination during entry into the armed forces and distributions of veterans benefits. The GI Bill, which I'll mention briefly in a minute, actually provided for 40% of home mortgages at the time. And FHA policies required or created incentives for private discrimination by classifying communities of color and integrated communities as risky investments. And of the 67,000 mortgages insured under the GI Bill in New York in the suburbs of northern New Jersey, over 66,900 went to white veterans. And housing policies also shifted white identity, as I referred to earlier. The creation of suburbs meant going from Slavs, Irish, and Italians being not white to a white suburban melting pot that created a pan-ethnic racial identity for the first time in the country beginning in the 1950s. I mentioned the GI Bill earlier. This also helped create the middle class by sending thousands of GIs to college, and many of them were the first in their families to do so. People of color were largely excluded from the military, and when they were, veteran offices often funneled them to technical degree programs. So the GI Bill created a huge pathway to opportunity for upward mobility and wealth amongst whites while hampering opportunity for people of color. And finally, we have, in 1956, the Federal Aid to Highway Act, which is passed. And this act invested millions of dollars in the creation of the federal highway system, fueling the movement of middle-class families out of the city and suburban sprawl. Highways funded by the act cut through African American and Latino communities and brought with them choking air pollution and resulting health problems. Again, we're seeing the intersections: housing, place, health, environment. These highways also accelerated the movement of jobs, creating industries out of the cities and into the suburbs. Now, instead of creating opportunity for all families, these local, state, and national policies restricted families of color to low-opportunity communities with high unemployment, declining tax bases, underfunded schools, and health and environmental hazards. And so what does this mean? It means that these policies lifted millions of white Americans out of poverty and into middle-class home ownership and had detrimental long-term impacts in communities of color. Not only did these policies drive neighborhood segregation, but they left communities of color situated in the most opportunity-starved neighborhoods with crumbling public school systems, the farthest from good jobs, and with inadequate transportation options. Even those able to purchase homes against all odds face poor housing quality and lower property values. And today, people of color, no matter their income, tend to live in high-poverty neighborhoods. This means that they also tend to live in neighborhoods far from good jobs, quality schools, and transportation options that they need to connect them to opportunity structures. And also, current policy has yet to redress the impact of past discriminatory policies. And therefore, we keep passing new policies on top of older foundational policies with a similar framework and structure that does not promote equity and opportunity. So for example, if we fast forward to 2008, when the mortgage lending crisis rocked the United States and eventually all the world economies, all communities were hit hard by the predatory and deregulated loan industry that stripped striving middle-class families of their savings. However, because of this history of policies that disinvested most in communities of color were most vulnerable to predatory lending schemes. Now, if you take this interesting fact, Black and Latino families were much more likely to receive a subprime mortgage than their white counterparts, even when they had the same income. In fact, Black families making more than $350,000 a year were 6 times more likely than their white counterparts to have a subprime loan. Now, had we paid attention to and addressed the way that communities of color were getting targeted by using a structural race analysis, we may have been able to prevent this kind of economic crisis as a whole. So what does racial equity really mean for all Americans? We are becoming a majority people of color nation, and this chart shows you that today, at least starting in 2010, and today, the majority of babies being born are babies of color. So what are the political and economic implications for all Americans given this picture? Well, if we look at Social Security for a moment, how is Social Security funded? Well, it's funded through payroll taxes and self-employed contribution taxes. This means that when all Americans are working, then funding for Social Security is doing better than when joblessness rates are high. Therefore, if the unemployment rate for people of color continues to be defined by staggeringly disproportionate and inequitable rates, then the future of Social Security as a critical social safety net for older Americans and those with disabilities is at stake. And we can anticipate that as communities continue to diversify, especially the growth of Latinos as a percentage of our population, this can only get worse. What will it mean for public education spending when the majority of students will be youth of color, with a large number of voting taxpayers are white senior citizens? Again, this is just another example of how racially inequitable policies that have created enormous wealth gaps and enormous opportunity gaps are important for all Americans to be concerned about as they threaten the prosperity for our entire nation. So I want to show you some data right now that sort of demonstrates where we are now as a country. This map that you're looking at is of people of color in congressional districts. The dark blue indicates communities where the percentages of people of color are between 70% and 99%. The lightest blue represents the communities where people of color are between 3.5% and 17.3%. All right, so we're seeing the majority of people of color really living along the south and the southwest, and we've got some California and some other spots in some of the major metropolitan cities in the country. Chicago, Michigan, Miami. I think we even see some spots in Seattle and the Northwest. But largely, people of color are mostly based in the Southeast and Southwest. Now, let's look at another map. This is a map of economic health in congressional districts. The dark yellow is very strong economic health. And we created this index using a number of different indicators, from access to schools, access to transit, looking at income, looking at access to jobs. The dark yellow is where economic health is very strong, where the light yellow is where economic health is very weak. Now, do you see any patterns between this picture and this picture? Essentially, it's the inverse, right? The places where there's a majority of people of color are also the places where economic health is the weakest. Now, oftentimes people say, well, if we just address poverty, and since people of color disproportionately have less income, well, then won't we get at addressing racial disparities? Well, we can't just examine class without examining the impact that one's race has on their opportunity. And I think the policy history is one example of how generations of certain groups of people have had a greater starting point than others, right? The average middle class, the average net worth of a middle class black person is only $15,000, while the average net worth of a working class person is $17,000. So that shows that even when black people are doing better with regard to income, their net worth is still less than a white person in a different class bracket. Additionally, this is a slide showing income, education, and equality, but no racial equity, right? And so going back to equality versus equity. So we see with black people with a college degree and white people with a college degree both making the same amount of money, $38,000. The net worth for that black person with that college degree is just over $17,000, and for that white person with a college degree, it's just under $75,000. And in terms of assets, a black person with a college degree has only $175 worth of assets, while the white person with a college degree has $19,823. So this shows you that even when things are equal in terms of income and education, there's still a disproportionate outcome with regard to wealth, and it is driven by, and it's very much, needs a race analysis to understand. This also is just another map that shows over the course of the past 25 years the median net worth of black people versus that of white people. So we've seen the net worth over the last 25 years remain fairly stagnant, increased a little bit, and then dropped around right after the recession of 2008, 2009. While for white communities, it has actually increased greatly. And again, everyone was experiencing the recession, but people were experiencing it much differently based on where they were located, either in terms of neighborhood, but also in terms of race. And I'll just add that income isn't enough to address racial disparities in net worth. We're experiencing the biggest wealth gap we've seen in 25 years. And home ownership accounts for 40% of the growth in the wealth gap. And if we think about the policy history that I talked about in terms of how people were able to create wealth, it was through home ownership. And for an entire generation, people of color were locked out of those opportunities. And so this is structural. So white Americans tend to buy 5 years sooner and own 26 years on average compared to 12 years for black Americans. And it also shows, that college only accounts for 5% of the gap. Unemployment is only 5% of the gap. Home ownership actually accounts for the vast majority of the growth in the wealth gap compared to other indicators. So in terms of applying the structural race analysis, there are a few considerations I want to walk through. The first is, in creating your strategies and thinking about your policy solutions, it is imperative to intentionally engage diverse people, organizations, and communities, because each community's body of knowledge, their ideas, their beliefs, they're unique, and they must be considered when crafting policy demands. And when attempting to partner with diverse communities, it's absolutely necessary to educate oneself about that community, to challenge one's assumptions about that community. If you recall earlier, I talked about how structural racialization, structural racism often has an impact on our attitudes and beliefs, right? We must really work hard to challenge our assumptions in the process and engage potential partners at the ground floor. That means not going to communities of color towards the middle of the development of a strategy, but really engaging those folks at the beginning, but even prior to that, making sure that you really understand their unique cultural context, the family structures that make it up, and then really engage folks around what it is that they need, right? And what it is that they know, because their body of knowledge is incredibly unique. And finally, rethinking and questioning how we do our work is an important aspect of racial equity work, right? Being okay and comfortable with the fact that we may need to be thinking differently about our strategies or how we enter into the work. For instance, I'll give an example that relates to the last slide. If we were to address the wealth gap between blacks and whites, given that it's an all-time high, if someone were to say, well, I know that it should be an education strategy. We actually, we're all about education, and that's the way that we're going to do this. Well, if education only accounts for 5% of the wealth gap, then really maybe that organization, an education advocacy organization, may be starting to think more deeply and critically about how do we actually get some of these folks linked to opportunities to own homes, right? And not saying that folks need to rethink their missions, but really thinking about the organizational priorities and our boundaries is an important aspect of our work. It's constantly reassessing where we are and what we need to do to get the work done. This next slide are about 5 different questions. It's a tool that you can use to start to begin to identifying the structural problems that are really getting at the root cause of inequity in your community. So the first question we might ask is, what is the problem we're trying to solve? We'll then want to know who is most marginalized by the problem and where they're located geographically, and also to really pay attention to race, gender, and class. And we'll also want to know and ask ourselves who is doing well despite the problem, and where are they located, thinking specifically about race, gender, and class. And then we ask folks to think about at least three, and no more than 6 institutions that are impacting the problem that we're trying to solve. And they could either be impacting the problem because they did something wrong, they're doing something right, or they're doing nothing, or some combination of the 3. And then we ask folks to think critically about at least 3 policies that are impacting the problem if it's not obvious or redundant from the institutions that we've named. There are additional questions, and what I'll make sure to do is pass on to Megan and the USBC staff a full toolkit for identifying structural problems, because it really does help engage folks in thinking about root causes of a particular issue. So now we have about 10 minutes, and I want to shut up so folks have an opportunity to engage and give reflections. There are a few guiding questions. Folks can either make comments or ask other questions, but for you all to consider, has your thinking shifted regarding the way and the role that race plays in equity and opportunity, and how might your organization begin to address racial equity? And finally, and also very importantly, what kind of tools would you need to execute such strategies? So with that note, I'd like to open it up for questions or answers or comments. And thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Julia. While we are taking the Q&A and while we're waiting for folks who might want to type in some reflections about your reflection questions, I'll also just go ahead and launch, or would you like me to wait to launch the poll or do it? Go ahead and do it.
Sure, yeah. I mean, you can launch it whenever. Yeah, I think now it's good.
I'll let it
and then
run
we could
in the
do
background
Yep, and we can announce
that while we're doing questions.
Yep.
So I do see some more coming in here. We did have we had a number of exclamations that came in around the koalas in Denmark. Also had some nice comments and reactions about the equality equity picture slide and how powerful that was. Simple yet powerful. One of our first questions early on was actually a bit political in the wake of the election last week. Right off the bat, it seems that, the questioner says, right off the bat, it seems that gerrymandering is a major obstacle to your goals. And how do we plan to approach this problem, and or how should we? So it's a question around gerrymandering.
Yeah, I mean, I think I completely agree. It is, I was watching The Daily Show a few days ago, and I learned something new every time I watch fake news. Isn't that something? And they had a map of Texas and a breakdown of their congressional districts by a political party. And Austin, right, which is the one little sort of blue spot in that entire state, actually is split up into 6 different congressional districts, meaning that, and they are bundled in with other Republican-leaning districts that are also less diverse, which essentially means that that particular community will never necessarily have an elected representative that could possibly, really address the unique diversity of that community, right? So I would definitely say that I think gerrymandering is definitely a issue, is a electoral organizing issue that folks really need to get behind. And I think you're right, it's definitely going to have an impact on our ability to move forth policy. Look at the gridlock in Congress right now. It's been almost impossible to move things nationally, and folks have really had to focus hard on doing things locally on the state level. So agreed on all fronts, and I would just say that, our partnering with organizations that are thinking about that, thinking about how electoral organizing has to happen differently, and our strategies around that, I think is really key to addressing racial equity, definitely, and representation.
Great. This is probably a quick one. When you were talking about why not just a poverty strategy, where does the term poverty come from, or who defines poverty?
We're using the federal definition for poverty, so the U.S. Census definition for poverty.
Great, thank you. Having some comments about, yes, please send out the toolkit on identifying structural problems, so maybe we can also link to that in the same spot with the recording. And I did chat out that link again for anyone that missed it. Do look in the chat box on your webinar control panel, and you'll see that live link there. Here's a meaty question for you. The questioner asks, help me to reconcile the comment that structural racism does not require an intent to discriminate with the examples offered, for example, about redlining in mortgage lending, the GI Bill, shutting out African Americans from meaningful military opportunity, that some of these examples seem to be very intentional examples of race-based discrimination, and how does that reconcile with it not requiring an intent to discriminate?
Yeah, well, I'll give you an example. So going back to the Federal Act to Highways that was created, so one of the really interesting, fundamental things that this particular act did in 1956 was it changed the calculus for funding priorities for the federal government with regard to transportation. So prior to the establishment of the Federal Highway Act, a large percentage of transportation dollars are going to fund transit, public transit, streetcars, buses, and with the creation of the Federal Highway Act, they created a new calculus, which is essentially an 80-20 split, meaning that 80% of funds for federal funds for transportation were now earmarked for highways, which I said before are largely benefiting people who are able to escape the cities and into the suburbs. With that, jobs, good grocery stores, good schools also followed. Well, So that was a foundational piece of policy that was not necessarily explicitly racist, right? But it actually drove folks, it created intensely segregated communities, right? And kept communities in inner cities deprived of resources. So today, still the math for the federal highway, for all federal transportation dollars, follows that same calculus. 80% for highways and 20% for public transit, right? So I would think that people who are currently negotiating on, I think, MAP 21, which is the, the transportation reauthorization bill, if they were really thinking with a structural race lens, they might want to reconsider that kind of calculus, right? Because right now, we're in a situation where there is incredibly high unemployment rates in people of color communities, yet the job centers are not located in those communities, and the transportation is not available for those communities to get to those jobs. So it's exacerbating sort of this, this unemployment and this unable to access opportunities. So, so I think the Federal Highway Act, I think, is a good example of how, while it wasn't explicitly racist on its onset, it had extremely disproportionate outcomes based on race, and we continue to create current policy based on the same calculus that we created back in the 1950s that continue to disadvantage people of color communities at the expense of white folks, white communities, or more affluent white communities having access to resources.
So it could be, it sounds like part of what you're saying is that while there may have been an intent in the past, that could be carrying on, and that intent is no longer there today.
Exactly, yeah, and which is why we need to look more deeply and think about race more explicitly, because oftentimes we don't necessarily, we'll see that, without a structural race analysis that allows us to really understand who is doing well and who is, who's not doing well, right?
Yeah, without that lens, it's not as visible.
Yeah.
So I did go ahead and flip the first poll. So definitely seeing some movement up through the numbers for the question about folks' individual understanding. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the other one. So folks, you should be seeing the second poll about you applying to your organization or coalition work while we ask a couple more questions. So here's a question around approaching individuals, and what can we do to help folks who mentally are putting limits on themselves because they're stuck in a box and not understanding structural racism. Do you have any recommendations for how those on this call could spread this understanding to others?
Sure. I mean, if you're talking about an interpersonal, am I understanding the question correctly? So what can individuals do to get other folks to sort of understand the analysis? Is that the question?
I think so, yes. It's a little hard to understand sometimes in writing, but
Well, I would say first and foremost, staying connected to the national USBC network. As Megan mentioned, we've been doing really deep work with the national network for the past year now, and there have been a number of different opportunities where we've been able to really kind of engage in these conversations. So, I'd first suggest at the next big gathering to identify those leaders or those folks in your communities who have influence that need to understand this and bring those folks along. And they're also, CSI does workshops like this. This is only 1 hour, but we oftentimes tailor these workshops to be a day or 2 days to even get beyond just the understanding and towards the thinking collectively about what our strategies might look like to be more inclusive. So that's also an opportunity. And then finally, I think there is, we deal on the structural plane, right? We're really looking at that meta-analysis of how systems and structures interact together to produce opportunity or to produce barriers. But there are a number of really great organizations that also do work around, interpersonal cultural competency work. There's a group called White Males as Full Diversity Partners, the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, the People's Institute Against Racism, and they have an Undoing Racism training. So there's a number of other organizations that do work individually and around helping people come together interpersonally around understanding these things. But again, USBC has been a really great place for education and ongoing learning around these issues, and in particular how it applies to the work that you all are doing around promoting breastfeeding, and particularly increasing those kind of those rates for communities that have disproportionately lower rates of breastfeeding.
Great. Gosh, we're getting a number of really great comments that I will be sure to share with Julia and others after the call. But I know we're running low on time, so I'm going to eke out a couple of questions here. One is specifically to the breastfeeding field. Do you think that there are any existing policies regarding breastfeeding that are structurally racist, and if so, which ones?
I would say in terms of policies that have the potential, that are well intended, that have the potential to, reproduce inequities. We might begin in looking at the, break time for nursing mothers law. While from my understanding, it is a law that supports, women who are hourly workers and not salary workers. A lot of low-income, low-wage workers are disproportionately women of color, and those workers oftentimes are not in the kinds of jobs where they have the opportunity or the ability to ask their employer for break time, or oftentimes those, for fear of maybe retribution, they're not unionized jobs, right? So I think that's an example of a law that in terms of the implementation needs to be thought through very critically, because it has the potential to reproduce racial disparities, right? But in intention, it's a great policy because it's, hey, it's supporting lower income women or women who are, blue-collar workers to have the opportunity to breastfeed, right? So in intention, it's great, but in terms of the implementation, we have to think really critically about how these kinds of policies are implemented to make sure that everyone has a chance to benefit, including those women of color who are disproportionately stuck in these low-wage jobs, fast food jobs, where they don't have a place to pump, or they might face retribution from employer or even being fired for asking or demanding to have, that law exercised for their benefit. So that's just one example. I think there's probably some others as well.
Yeah, that's a really great example too, to highlight for us how important it is that it's not just the design of the legislation initially, but also the ongoing implementation and the work that needs to happen even past getting the policy passed or the regulation in force. So that is a really good example. So I know we're beyond our time here. I did go ahead and show the poll of the second question, so folks can look at that and where they fall. So perhaps what we can do, again, we will be posting both the recording and the PDF of the slides on the link that you see in your webinar chat. We'll make sure to also link to that on the USBC homepage so that it's easy for folks to find who may have registered but not been able to attend the webinar today. And we'll talk about some other ways to be continuing this dialogue and this conversation, because I do see a number of great comments and questions here that could be continued perhaps in an online format beyond today. So thank you so much to everyone, and thank you to Ms. Julia for her great presentation and questions and answers today.
All right, thank you all for having me.
Thank you, and take care, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.